You probably used a toothbrush today without giving it a second thought. It sat where it always sits, beside the sink, waiting for a job so ordinary it barely feels like history at all. A few quick strokes, a rinse, and you move on. But the problem that toothbrush solves is far older than plastic, toothpaste, or even the idea of modern hygiene. For as long as people have eaten food, bits of it have stayed behind. For as long as teeth have helped people chew, those teeth have cracked, rotted, loosened, and caused pain. Clean teeth may feel modern. The problem never was. If you like hidden history hiding inside normal objects, subscribe now, because this story gets strange fast. The first surprise is simple. People did not ignore their teeth in the past. They knew very well when something in the mouth felt dirty or painful. They may not have understood bacteria. They may not have known what plaque was, but they knew the feeling of food stuck between teeth. They knew the taste of a foul mouth after sleep. They knew what happened when a small ache turned into a deep, pounding pain that spread into the jaw. So even very early people tried to do something about it. That matters, because modern people sometimes imagine the past as one long stretch of total filth, as if no one noticed these problems until science finally arrived. That is not how humans usually work. People notice discomfort almost immediately. Then they experiment. They rub, scrape, chew, rinse, improvise, and repeat whatever seems to help. The history of the toothbrush begins there, not with a factory, but with trial and error. Some of the oldest methods were extremely simple. A person could take a small twig, chew one end until it softened and split into fibers, and then rub those fibers against the teeth. That sounds crude now, but it was not foolish. A fresh twig was cheap, easy to replace, and already shaped like a tool. In many parts of the world, people used chewing sticks made from specific plants, because some woods were fibrous, some smelled fresh, and some may even have had mild natural compounds that helped the mouth feel cleaner. A stick was not a modern toothbrush, but it was not nothing either. It was a practical answer to a daily irritation, and chewing sticks lasted a very long time. In some places they lasted so long that they still survive today in traditional use. That tells you something important. When a tool stays around for centuries, it usually means it solved enough of the problem to remain useful. Not perfectly, just well enough. Other people used cloth. A scrap of linen or other fabric could be wrapped around a finger, dampened and rubbed across the teeth and gums. Again, simple. Again, easy to overlook, but the logic is clear. If the teeth feel coated, rub the coating away. If the mouth smells bad, wipe it clean. You do not need a microscope to think that way. You only need a mouth. Then there were powders. This is where the story starts to sound a little harsher. In ancient societies, people experimented with abrasive mixtures meant to scrape the teeth clean. Some versions included ash. Some used crushed shells, powdered bone, charcoal, salt, or ground minerals. Ancient Egyptian formulas are often mentioned because they left evidence of tooth-cleaning powders made from ingredients that could act almost like an early toothpaste, minus the smooth, minty comfort modern people expect. These mixtures could help remove buildup, but they could also be rough. A cleaner tooth surface came at a cost if the material was too abrasive. Would you trust ash and crushed shell in your mouth every morning? What makes these methods interesting is that they reveal the real shape of the problem. People were not only trying to make their mouths look nicer, they were trying to manage comfort, smell, and function. A bad tooth could make chewing miserable. Swollen gums could bleed. Infection could spread. In a world without easy dental treatment, prevention mattered even if people did not call it prevention. Ancient Egypt gives us one of the clearest early pictures of this effort. Written references and surviving recipes suggest that people used tooth powders, made from combinations like rock salt, dried plant matter, pepper, mint, or powdered minerals depending on period and interpretation. Some of these ingredients probably freshened the breath. Some increased abrasion. Some may simply have seemed medicinal because they were sharp, strong, or rare. The exact formulas varied, and not every person used the same thing, but the broader point is firm. People were actively trying to clean their mouths thousands of years ago. that same pattern appears elsewhere. In parts of Asia, especially in China, early forms of mouth-cleaning tools included chewing sticks, and eventually more specialized implements that moved closer to what we would call a toothbrush. Long before mass production, the idea was already forming. The hand works, but a dedicated tool might work better. The mouth was becoming a place where design mattered, and yet for most of history, none of this was standardized. There was no single object waiting in every home. There was no universal morning routine. There was no dentist office ready to give advice, no shelf full of branded options, no bright package promising whiter teeth in 7 days. What existed instead was a patchwork of habits shaped by class, region, materials, and custom. A wealthy household might afford more refined powders or imported substances with a pleasant smell. A poorer household might use whatever was local and cheap. One community might trust a particular wood for chewing sticks. Another might prefer cloth and salt. Another might do little beyond rinsing the mouth with water and scraping the teeth with fingernails or a small pick when discomfort became impossible to ignore. The methods differed, but the human need did not. This is also where food enters the story. Teeth were not suffering in exactly the same way across all periods and places. Diet changed everything. A person eating coarse grains, tough meat, and fibrous plants faced one kind of wear. A person eating more refined carbohydrates and sweet foods faced another. Sometimes older diets wore teeth down physically. Later diets often fed decay more aggressively. The mouth kept adapting to changing habits, and people kept trying to catch up with tools that were still basic. There is a quiet irony here. Human beings built cities, ships, temples, armies, trade routes, and writing systems long before they settled on a toothbrush most modern people would recognize. That sounds almost ridiculous until you remember how many inventions arrive late, not because humans are slow, but because a problem can be managed badly for a very long time. Before someone creates a cleaner solution, people often live with inconvenience for centuries. Then one design change suddenly makes the old way look absurd. Still, the older ways should not be dismissed too quickly. A chew stick was portable. Cloth cost little. Powders could be mixed from familiar materials. These methods fit the worlds that produced them. They were local, cheap, and easy to replace. A modern toothbrush feels obvious because you grew up with one. It would not have felt obvious to someone who already had a stick, a rag, a pinch of powder, and no reason to believe the mouth needed anything more advanced. That is why the early history of tooth cleaning is not really about one invention showing up and saving everyone. It is about a long period when people recognized the problem but only partly understood it. They could feel the results. They could see stained teeth, swollen gums, broken molars, and awful breath. They could invent methods to rub, scrape, freshen, and polish. But they were still operating in the dark about the deeper cause of decay and disease. And that limit changed everything. Because if you do not know what is actually damaging the mouth, you judge a method by what you can feel right away. Does the tooth feel smoother? Does the breath smell better? Does the gum stop aching for now? If the answer seems to be yes, the method survives. If the answer is no, people try another stick, another powder, another habit. For centuries, that was the pattern. So the first chapter of toothbrush history is not the story of one perfect tool arriving early. It is the story of millions of people trying to solve the same daily irritation with whatever they had in reach: sticks, cloth, salt, ash, powdered shell, charcoal, herbs, water, finger pressure, repetition. Small attempts against a problem that never went away. Cleaning the mouth mattered. People knew that much. But cleaning was only half the battle. The deeper danger was still hidden, and the next part of the story begins there. People were trying to fight damage they could not fully explain. That meant pain stayed common, bad theories survived, and some of the strangest ideas in dental history had room to grow. Because the real problem was not that people failed to clean their teeth. The real problem was that they did not yet know what they were fighting. For all the effort people put into cleaning their mouths, they were still facing a problem they did not truly understand. Teeth hurt, gums bled, breath turned foul, cavities deepened, teeth loosened and fell out. But the real cause stayed hidden for most of history because the enemy was too small to see and too ordinary to notice. People could feel the damage, they just could not explain it correctly. That gap between pain and explanation shaped everything. When modern people think about dental health, they think in terms like plaque, bacteria, acid, infection, and enamel. Those ideas feel basic now. They are built into toothpaste ads, school lessons, and dentist visits. But for most of human history, a person with a toothache was not working from that kind of knowledge. They were working from sensation, tradition, rumor, and inherited belief. If your tooth throbbed in the middle of the night, you did not need a theory to know something was wrong. But without the right theory, the wrong ones could survive for centuries. One of the strangest examples was the belief in toothworms. Variations of this idea appeared in different cultures over long stretches of time. The logic, in a way, made sense within the limits of what people could observe. Teeth developed holes. Pain seemed to pulse from deep inside. Decay looked like something was eating the tooth from within. So some people concluded that tiny worms must be burrowing into the tooth and causing the pain. It was wrong, but it was not random. It was an attempt to explain visible damage with the tools of the imagination people had at the time. And once a bad explanation takes hold, it can shape treatment in ways that feel terrifying now. Instead of preventing decay at its true source, people often focused on drawing out the supposed worm, calming the pain, or destroying whatever invisible force they thought was inside the tooth. Remedies could include smoke, heat, herbal mixtures, oils, strong rinses, and all kinds of local practices passed from one person to another. Some treatments may have offered temporary relief. Others probably made things worse. But when people are desperate, temporary relief can feel like proof. That is one of the quiet patterns running through the history of medicine. A treatment does not need to be correct to survive. It only needs to seem useful often enough. Tooth pain was especially good at keeping false ideas alive because it was unpredictable. Sometimes the pain flared and then faded. Sometimes pressure released. Sometimes an infected tooth cracked or drained, and the person felt better for a while. That improvement could easily be credited to whatever treatment had been tried last. A smoke cure, a heated needle, a bitter rinse, a prayer, a scraping tool. Cause and effect blurred together. And while theories drifted, the actual consequences were brutal. A bad tooth was not a small inconvenience in the pre-modern world. It could change what a person ate, how they spoke, how they slept, and how well they could work. A cracked molar could turn every meal into a calculation. A rotting tooth could fill the mouth with foul taste and spreading pain. An abscess could swell the face, bring fever, and in severe cases, become life-threatening. Modern people often separate dental health from general health because dentistry sits in its own category. Earlier, people had no such luxury. Mouth problems spilled straight into the rest of life. Imagine trying to farm, march, sew, write, trade, or care for children while your jaw is pounding day and night. Imagine eating without modern painkillers when one side of your mouth feels like a live wound. That was not rare, it was ordinary. Would bad teeth even stand out as a crisis if nearly everyone around you had them too? That question matters because normality can hide suffering. In a world where tooth loss, bad breath, gum disease, and extraction were common, people did not always treat them as shocking signs of collapse. They were part of the background of life. That does not mean people accepted them calmly. It means people lived with a lower expectation of what a healthy mouth could be. This was also a world where dental treatment was often crude, expensive, or delayed until the pain became impossible. The simplest answer to a ruined tooth was often removal. Extraction could end the pain, but getting there was another story. Before anesthesia, before modern sterilization, before advanced instruments, pulling a tooth could be a violent, frightening act. It was not something people rushed toward with confidence. They avoided it, delayed it, feared it, and then finally submitted when the alternatives seemed worse. Different societies had different practitioners for this work. Sometimes a trained healer handled it. Sometimes a barber surgeon did. Sometimes a tooth drawer traveled from place to place. Sometimes the person in pain relied on local improvisation and family help. What united these situations was uncertainty. Relief was possible, but so were infection, injury, and more pain. And class shaped the experience in ways that matter to this story. Wealthy people were not magically protected from dental problems, but they often had better access to softer foods, cosmetic attention, expensive compounds, and practitioners. They could sometimes hide damage better, delay consequences longer, or seek intervention earlier. At the same time, wealth could create new problems. Richer diets often included more sugar and refined foods once those became available, and those foods were brutal on teeth. A person with money might have access to luxury and decay in the same mouth. Poorer people had fewer options in both directions. They might rely more on local materials, endure pain longer, and lose teeth without replacement. Their oral health was shaped by labor, diet, scarcity, and access. In that sense, the mouth became another place where inequality left marks on the body. Sugar made this divide even sharper. As trade expanded and sugar became more available in many parts of the world, people began consuming something their teeth were poorly equipped to handle at those levels. At first, sugar was rare, costly, and associated with wealth. Then over time, in many societies, it became increasingly common. That shift changed the history of teeth more than people at the time could fully grasp. A mouth that might once have dealt mostly with rough grains, fibrous plants, and limited sweetness, now faced a steady chemical assault from sticky, fermentable foods that fed the very processes causing decay. People did not need lab science to notice that something was going wrong. They could see mouths worsening. They could feel pain appearing earlier and more often. But without a full explanation, they were reacting to symptoms rather than controlling the cause. This is where the history becomes bigger than the toothbrush. Teeth were not just about vanity or comfort. They sat at the intersection of diet, trade, medicine, class, and daily habit. A rotting mouth could reflect changing food systems. A bad theory about toothworms could reflect the limits of pre-modern biology. A painful extraction could show the limits of surgery before modern medicine. Even breath carried social meaning. A clean mouth suggested discipline, refinement, and control. A foul one could signal neglect, poverty, sickness, or simply the conditions of the age. People also connected the mouth to the rest of the body in ways that were sometimes surprisingly perceptive and sometimes completely mistaken. They knew mouth pain could spread misery. They knew disease in the mouth weakened the person. But they lacked the model that would connect bacteria, gum infection, sugar metabolism, and long-term decay into one coherent system. So, oral care remained fragmented. One culture emphasized rinsing, another preferred scraping, another used powders, another prized fresh breath more than deep cleaning. Everyone was dealing with part of the truth. And still, despite all these limits, people kept pushing toward better tools. That persistence is important. History can make earlier people look passive when they were often anything but. They were not sitting in darkness waiting for modern dentistry to rescue them. They were experimenting constantly, seeking any form of relief. They sharpened picks, mixed compounds, chewed fresh twigs, rubbed cloth across the teeth, and searched for anything that seemed to reduce pain or improve the feel of the mouth. They just lacked the unifying design and the scientific explanation that would eventually make oral care simpler, more repeatable, and easier to spread. The old world of dental care was a world of half solutions. Enough knowledge to know the mouth mattered, not enough knowledge to protect it reliably. Enough experience to invent tools, not enough clarity to standardize them. Enough suffering to force action, not enough understanding to end the cycle. That is why the next turning point did not begin with a breakthrough in biology. It began with a change in object design. Someone had to take this scattered human effort, this jumble of sticks, cloths, powders, and guesswork, and turn it into a dedicated tool. people could use again and again. Not a remedy, not a theory, a device. And once that happened, the history of cleaning teeth started to move in a new direction, because people had been trying to solve the problem for centuries. The strange part is that the basic form of the answer existed long before. Most of the world was ready to trust it. The idea of a dedicated toothbrush feels so obvious now that it is easy to assume it must have spread the moment someone invented it. A handle, some bristles, a simple movement across the teeth. Clean the mouth more effectively than cloth or a twig. Problem solved. But history is rarely that neat. The toothbrush, in a form modern people would at least recognize, appeared long before it became a normal object in everyday life. That gap matters because it shows something larger about human habits. People do not adopt a new object just because it exists. They adopt it when it becomes cheap enough, useful enough, familiar enough, and trusted enough to replace what they already know. One of the earliest clear ancestors of the modern bristle toothbrush is usually traced to China, especially during the Tang period, when tools made with a handle and bristles moved closer to the design we know today. The key change was simple but important. Instead of rubbing the teeth with a finger, a cloth, or a chewed stick, the user now had a tool built specifically for reaching the surfaces of the teeth, with many small fibers at once. Those fibers were often made from animal hair, especially stiff hairs such as boar bristles. The handle could be made from bone, bamboo, or other available materials. That combination created something new. It was not just an improvised cleaning object. It was a manufactured design with a clear purpose. That may sound like a small step, but it solved several problems at once. A chewed twig could fray into fibers, but not always evenly. A cloth could rub the outer surfaces of the teeth, but it did not give the same concentrated contact in narrow spaces. A handle with set bristles allowed a person to hold the cleaning surface at a better angle, move it more precisely, and repeat the same action day after day. In design terms, this was the difference between making do and using a tool built for the job. It still had flaws. Animal bristles could be rough. They could hold moisture. They could wear down badly. They were not the smooth nylon bristles modern people know. Some were harsh enough to irritate the gums or scratch surfaces if used aggressively. So the first true toothbrush was not automatically a pleasant object. It was a better idea, not yet a perfect one. Would you have traded your familiar old method for a brush made with stiff animal hair? That question helps explain why adoption was slow. A new tool has to beat habit, and habit is powerful. If someone had cleaned their mouth for years with a twig, a cloth, salt, ash, or powder, a bristle brush might not feel necessary. It might feel expensive, strange, or even uncomfortable. That does not mean people were irrational. It means they judged the object by immediate experience. Was it easier? Was it affordable? Did it feel good enough to justify changing a routine that already existed? As versions of the toothbrush gradually moved beyond China and into wider circulation, especially through trade and later European interest, the object entered cultures that already had their own cleaning habits. So the toothbrush was not arriving in an empty space. It was competing with existing methods that were deeply familiar and often much cheaper. Europe eventually took up the idea, but slowly and unevenly. Early imported examples and later local versions did not instantly turn brushing into a universal habit. In some cases, the brushes were treated more like refined personal items than essential tools. In others, they were simply too costly for ordinary people to use regularly. A free stick from outside or a cloth from the home still had one major advantage: almost anyone could get one. The toothbrush also had a social image problem. For long periods, many objects that later became normal began as signs of refinement, luxury, or personal fussiness. Brushing the teeth with a dedicated instrument could seem excessive to people who were used to rougher, more practical methods. That is another recurring pattern in history. A tool often appears first among people with money, status, or access, then slowly moves downward into common life once production changes. That is where England becomes important, especially with the figure of William Addis in the late 18th century. Addis is often credited with helping commercialize the toothbrush in Britain by producing versions with handles and bristles in a more organized way. The details of the story are sometimes simplified in popular retellings, but the larger point remains useful. Tooth cleaning was shifting from improvised personal practice toward repeatable production. A toothbrush could now be made, sold, copied, and distributed as a recognizable consumer object. This was a turning point because once an object enters manufacturing, its future changes. It no longer depends only on local habit or individual improvisation. It enters workshops, supply chains, retail patterns, and eventually advertising. It becomes something that can spread at scale. Still, mass production alone did not guarantee mass adoption. A product can exist in stores and still fail to become part of daily life. Plenty of people in earlier centuries continued to live without a toothbrush, even when toothbrushes were available somewhere. In the larger economy, access was uneven, cost still mattered, custom still mattered, and many people were still living in a world where dental pain was common enough that cleaning the teeth did not yet feel like a fully solved or standardized discipline. There is also a more basic point. A toothbrush only works well as part of a habit. Owning one is not the same as using it consistently. A person needs repetition. Morning, evening, again and again. That kind of discipline feels normal now, because it has been taught, enforced, advertised, and built into childhood from an early age. Earlier societies had not yet created that level of routine around the object. So the toothbrush spent a long time in an in-between state. It existed. It was useful. It clearly improved on older methods in certain ways. But it had not yet become universal, and it had not yet fully escaped its image as a specialized or limited object. The design itself kept improving. Handles became more standardized. Manufacturing methods became more reliable. Bristles were arranged more deliberately. Over time, different regions developed their own styles and materials. Each improvement made the brush more practical and easier to imagine as part of ordinary life. Yet the deeper cultural shift was still incomplete. What changed that shift was not just invention. It was pressure from larger systems. Cities were growing. Consumer culture was expanding. Industrial production was making more goods available to more people. Ideas about the body, cleanliness, and discipline were changing. The mouth was starting to matter not only as a site of pain, but as a sign of respectability, self-control, and modern habit. A person's teeth could affect appearance, smell, confidence, and social standing. That made the toothbrush more than a cleaning tool. It made it part of how a person presented themselves to the world. And even then, the final push had not arrived. The strange thing about the toothbrush is that it spent centuries moving from one stage to another without fully taking over daily life. First, there was the universal human problem, then the scattered solutions, then the bristle design, then the manufactured product. Each step mattered, but none of them by themselves forced millions of people into the same regular routine. That is what the next chapter changes, because the toothbrush was now real. The design existed, the object could be made, sold, and improved, but it still needed one more force to move it from occasional use and private refinement into ordinary mass behavior. It needed institutions, pressure, and repetition on a scale earlier centuries had never created. The brush had been invented. The harder task was turning it into a habit. And once that happened, the toothbrush stopped being a specialty object and became something sitting beside almost every sink in the modern world. A toothbrush can be invented, improved, and sold for centuries without becoming truly universal. That is the part of the story people often miss. The object itself was not enough. A brush sitting in a shop or in the home of a wealthy person did not automatically create a daily routine across an entire society. What changed the toothbrush was not one single genius improvement. It was the moment bigger systems began forcing regularity into ordinary life. That is when the toothbrush stopped being just a personal tool and became part of modern discipline. For a long time, brushing your teeth with a dedicated brush could still feel optional. Some people did it, some did not. Some used other methods. Some cared only when pain appeared. Some treated the brush as a luxury item, or at least as a refined personal object rather than a necessity. That was slowly changing in the 19th century as industrial production expanded. Consumer goods spread more widely, and ideas about cleanliness became more closely tied to respectability. The modern home was beginning to fill with routine objects. Soap, towels, mirrors, combs, razors, and brushes all became part of a broader culture of bodily management. The toothbrush fit naturally into that world, but it still needed one more thing: mass behavioral training. That training came from several directions at once. Schools taught hygiene more directly. Dentists grew more professionalized, turning the practice into a respected medical field. Manufacturers produced more standardized brushes. Tooth powders and later pastes became easier to buy. Advertising began telling people not only that they could brush, but that they should. The mouth was no longer treated only as a place of pain. It became a place of visible self-care, health, and social judgment. And then the military helped lock the habit into place. Large modern armies do more than fight. They standardize behavior. They teach people how to sleep, march, wash, shave, fold, eat, clean equipment, and maintain their bodies according to routine. Once millions of men were drawn into military systems in the late 19th and especially early 20th century, habits that might once have been personal became institutional. During the World Wars, many soldiers were expected or encouraged to maintain oral hygiene with more regularity than they might have at home. A clean, functional mouth mattered to military discipline, readiness, and health. Armies did not create the toothbrush, but they helped normalize the expectation that brushing should happen regularly. That kind of conditioning has enormous power. A habit learned under strict routine often survives after the institution releases its grip. Men who served, brushed regularly, and returned home could carry the routine back into civilian life. Families absorbed it. Children inherited it. Over time, brushing became less a sign of refinement and more a baseline expectation. Would brushing have become universal as quickly without schools, armies, and advertising pushing it into daily life? Probably not. The 20th century completed what earlier centuries had only begun. Toothbrushes became cheaper, more standardized, and more widely distributed. Materials improved. The later shift to synthetic bristles, especially nylon in the 20th century, solved some of the old problems of animal hair. Nylon dried more effectively, could be produced with greater consistency, and felt like part of a cleaner, more modern product world. This matters more than it may seem. Once the brush itself became more hygienic, affordable, and easy to manufacture, it was far easier to sell it as a universal household item. Toothpaste changed the experience too. Earlier powders and pastes could be abrasive, messy, or inconsistent. Modern toothpaste made brushing easier to market because it turned a practical task into a sensory routine. Foam, mint, a clean taste, a smooth texture, a bright tube, a familiar smell. These details helped make brushing feel not like scraping away danger, but like refreshing the body. That changed compliance. People are more likely to repeat a habit when the ritual itself feels pleasant. Advertising saw the opportunity immediately. This was one of the great modern transformations of ordinary objects. Companies no longer sold products only by pointing to utility. They sold identity, fear, attractiveness, confidence, freshness, and social approval. A toothbrush was not just for preventing pain. It was for being presentable. Toothpaste was not only about oral care. It was about fresh breath, bright smiles, romance, professionalism, and self-respect. The mouth entered the world of modern image making. That had benefits and distortions. On one hand, millions of people adopted a routine that genuinely improved oral health. On the other, advertising exaggerated, moralized, and turned ordinary hygiene into a field of insecurity. A clean mouth became tied to ideas about discipline, status, and desirability. The toothbrush was now linked not only to health but to judgment. Still, behind all that messaging sat a real historical victory. For most of human history, people had to improvise with twigs, cloth, ash, salt, powders, and guesswork. Now large parts of the world had access to a cheap, repeatable tool, designed specifically for the problem. Even if the marketing became manipulative, the underlying object represented a real gain in human comfort and prevention. Public health campaigns reinforced this further, as dentistry became more organized, and states began caring more about the health of populations. Oral hygiene entered the language of prevention. The message changed from "deal with pain when it arrives" to "build habits that stop damage earlier." That is a major civilizational shift. Prevention is not only medical knowledge, it is also scheduling. It means teaching people to act before suffering forces them to act. The toothbrush became one of the clearest symbols of that logic. Use it daily, use it before the pain, use it whether or not anything feels wrong. That kind of advice sounds obvious now, but it represents a deep change from older ways of living, where action often followed discomfort rather than preceding it. The modern bathroom reflects this hidden history more than most people realize. The toothbrush beside the sink is connected to factory manufacturing, chemical materials, military discipline, school education, advertising, psychology, dentistry, public health, shipping systems, and global retail networks. It looks simple because all those systems have done their job so well that the object now feels natural. But nothing about it was natural at the start. It was built into normal life over centuries. That is why the toothbrush belongs to the same larger history as soap, sewers, clean water, and food safety. It is one of those ordinary things that quietly changed what daily life feels like. It lowered a burden so common that earlier generations often treated it as unavoidable. Pain, foul breath, gum bleeding, tooth loss, and chronic mouth discomfort did not disappear. But the balance shifted. A person now had a practical daily defense that cost little and asked only for repetition, and repetition changed the world. A child learns to brush before understanding bacteria. A parent reminds them morning and night. A dentist checks technique. A school poster reinforces the message. A supermarket keeps the shelf full. A commercial makes freshness feel urgent. A manufacturer updates the bristle pattern. All of this happens around an object so ordinary it barely draws attention. Yet behind it stands thousands of years of discomfort, failed explanations, rough experiments, and slow improvements. There is also a modern irony hiding in plain sight. Many people brush automatically now, without thinking about the long chain of human frustration behind the routine. The task feels boring precisely because history solved enough of the problem to make it boring. That is often the final form of successful infrastructure. It disappears into habit. Most people do not stand at the sink thinking about Egyptian powders, Chinese bristle brushes, toothworm theories, barber extractions, or wartime hygiene routines. They just brush. That is the victory. The object became so integrated into life that its own history vanished from view. And yet the old story still leaves traces. Fear of the dentist, sensitivity around bad breath, the social signal of teeth in photographs and conversation, the market for whitening, gum care, floss, mouthwash, and dental tools, the strong emotional reaction people have to tooth pain. All of that grows from the same old human reality. The mouth matters more than people want to think about until something goes wrong. So what did people use before toothbrushes? They used sticks chewed into fibers, cloth wrapped around fingers, salt, ash, crushed shells, charcoal, powders, picks, rinses, herbs. They used anything that might scrape away buildup, improve smell, or delay pain. They used methods shaped by local materials, social class, trade, and belief. Then slowly, over centuries, those scattered attempts gave way to one dedicated object. That object did not rise because it was flashy. It rose because it solved a real problem better than the old patchwork ever could. And that is the hidden history inside one of the most forgettable objects in your house. The toothbrush is not just a bathroom accessory. It is the final product of a very long human struggle against rot, pain, smell, and uncertainty. It represents trial and error across civilizations, It represents the shift from reacting to suffering to preventing it. It represents a moment when an everyday routine became part of health, discipline, and modern life itself. So the next time you brush your teeth, it is worth remembering that people spent thousands of years trying to solve that same problem with whatever they had in reach. If this changed the way you see something as ordinary as a toothbrush, subscribe for more hidden histories like this. Leave a like if you want more everyday object stories. And tell me in the comments which object I should break down next, because some of the most revealing history in the world is sitting quietly in your house waiting to be noticed.